I need to make an adjustment to my office hours today. Ordinarily it's from 1 to 3 on a Wednesday, but for today it will be immediately after this class until 1 o'clock and then from 3 to 4. And if you need help outside of those hours, you can still contact me on Teams or send me an email. It's just from 1 to 3 I have another appointment. Now, Friday, you've got a homework assignment that's due and the second midterm exam. We've already talked a little bit about that midterm exam, that you need to bring a laptop because there will be at least one problem where you're using Excel. And I previously mentioned that I'll provide a formula sheet. And as I thought about it a little bit more, and what I'd like you to be able to do, I thought it would be okay if you'd like to bring a page of your own notes. And so my thinking with that is if you wanted to outline for yourself, for instance, what is the analysis process you use for external rate of return? Because you're going to need to start from a blank workbook during the exam, a spreadsheet with nothing on it. You can't use a previous homework assignment and just change that for your spreadsheet stuff. And so if you want to put like a summary of the procedure on that page of notes that you're allowed to bring, or if you wanted to like identify the titles of columns that should be included for a certain process, then you're welcome to bring that. So it's just one page of notes, and I will collect those at the end of the exam. Do you have a question?
Is it just one side, or can it be?
Yeah, just one side. Yeah. Are there other questions?
What lectures will the test cover?
Okay, let's take a look at the schedule.
Can that sheet of paper be typed?
Yes, it can be typed. It should be letter sized or smaller.
Sure. And is there any restriction on what we put on it?
Nope.
Okay.
It can be whatever you like. If I was in your shoes, the only thing I'd probably bother putting on there would be maybe just a brief summary of the external rate of return process to remind myself, and then also maybe the what the spreadsheet looks like for an incremental analysis, maybe. I mean, I'm not giving you this because I'm thinking of some devious thing that I think you need a lot of support on. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be something you spend the next 48 hours perfecting. All right, so midterm exam 2 covers lecture 17 up to and including today's class meeting, 28. 17 to 28. I had this labeled wrong. All right. Are there other questions? So if we just look at this list of topics, let me see if I can zoom that in a little bit more. Where is it? So 17 through 28 includes bonds, internal rate of return, external rate of return, incremental rate of return, annual worth analysis, benefit cost, incremental benefit cost, cost effectiveness analysis, economic service life, and then today, replacement studies is just an extension of economic service life. You'll see from today's in-class exercise that we're just doing economic service life analysis on 2 alternatives. So that's a replacement study. Okay. All right, so on Friday, you'll be taking the test. I'll be standing in the back of the room making sure that nobody opens up a pre-existing spreadsheet file and it's just playing by the rules, not communicating during the test, of course. All right, let's talk about replacement studies. The photo on the left is a control system at a chemical plant, and you can see this is pretty old school stuff. We've got analog dials and an operator standing, observing the instrument panel and making sure that everything is operating smoothly. And so We talked a little bit on Monday about the reasons that you sometimes choose to replace equipment. And it may be that the equipment's breaking down more, and so that there's additional repair costs that there didn't used to be. We talked about how obsolescence may motivate replacement, or simply that the equipment is no longer competitive compared to newer equipment. But sometimes old things work just fine, and it may be the case that this equipment's still perfectly functional and competitive. The alternative to this older analog instrument panel you can see here is a digital control system, and there's not even operators sitting at the control panel, because maybe a lot of the functionality is automated, so that certain algorithms are deciding whether to open a valve or at what point to release the pressure from a holding tank. So the question in a replacement study is, when do you switch over from the older equipment to the newer equipment, even if the older equipment is still perfectly functional? Now, the objective in a comparison like this is to minimize the cost. And so just like on Monday, in economic service life analysis, we chose the number of years that minimizes the cost. You'd own something just as long as that number of years that keeps the total costs the lowest. The same is true when you're comparing two alternatives. Option A, which you already own, and option B, that you're thinking about buying. You do an economic service life analysis of both of those alternatives, and then you choose the alternative that has the lowest total annual worth of costs. So the Defender is the equipment that you already own. And remember that in the case like that, we've already talked about how the first cost is the current market value of the equipment. Because if you choose to keep some equipment that you already own, what you're foregoing is the opportunity to sell it to someone else. And so you could have, if you didn't keep it, gotten the market value for that equipment. Whereas the first cost for the Challenger is its initial purchase price. And then both the Defender and Challenger will have some sort of data that tells you over time how the market value is declining. And both the Defender and the Challenger will have operating costs associated. They may be different operating costs. It might be the case that the Challenger in part is more attractive because it has a lower operating cost with each passing year. And so we have to go through that a little bit complicated process of taking variable operating costs. Remember that equipment that's old and getting older may be progressively more expensive to own with each passing year. And so your operating costs may look like this. And part of the procedure that we followed in class last time was we took all of this to the present with the NPV function. And then once all of that amount was at the present, we found the equal annual equivalent. So that's an important part of the economic service life analysis, is you take variable operations pricing data and you annualize it so that it would be the same amount each year. So that's just one thing I wanted to remind you about, like when we had that template file that we used as the basis for the economic service life analysis in class last time. Part of that was taking the operating costs to the present and then re-annualizing them. Okay, so if no study period is specified, what that means is we don't have a specific time horizon in mind. We're just comparing these two options for however long they may naturally last. And so sometimes the Defender and the Challenger have a different natural life, where the equipment you already own, maybe your options are sell it now or keep it 1 more year, 2 more years, 3 more years, but maybe 3 is the maximum for the Defender. And it may be the case that the Challenger has a different number of years that it can be owned. Remember, ordinarily, we can't compare alternatives that have different useful lives. That's one of the things that we were pretty careful about when we were doing present value analysis. Like we would use the least common multiple approach or early termination or contract services to try and make both alternatives have the same useful life. But the one time it was okay for us to compare alternatives that had a different useful life was when we had calculated the annual cost of operation. And that's what you're doing in an economic service life analysis, is you're finding out what's the annual worth of the costs. And so it's okay for us to do a comparison between two alternatives, one that lasts 3 years and another that lasts 8 years, for example. It's okay for us to compare those two if no study period is specified. Our decision criteria would be the same. We're just going to own whichever option has the lowest total annual worth of costs. And then we're going to own it for the number of years that's associated with that lowest total cost. And then at the end of that period, then we would compare whatever alternatives are available at that point. So at the end of the Defender's useful life, maybe then we'd buy the Challenger. But we don't necessarily know. So no study period specified, is just buy it for however many years naturally lines up with the lowest cost. Now, in the real world, when you're doing economic service life analysis, you wouldn't just do the analysis now and not revisit it again in the future. You'd continually be updating and revising each year just to see, is your projection of cost holding up, or are there changes? So for instance, if you did an analysis and it said own the equipment for 5 years, but you had been speculating what the actual operation costs would be, maybe you can improve on your guess of the operating costs. Maybe suddenly it's way cheaper to get parts than it used to be before. You know, like, so if you owned a car and now there's a new model and everyone's switching over to the new model, it could be that the replacement parts for the old model are suddenly way less expensive than they used to be because there's less demand for those replacement parts. So the point is, there's a variety of factors that could shape things like your future operating costs. And so you repeat these studies every year just to make sure that it's still the best option for you to stay with a certain choice and for how long to do it. So I just wanted to mention that. All right, well, let's take a look at the in-class exercise for today. This is in-class exercise 28. We're going to do the same economic service life analysis that we did on Monday, but we're going to do it for two options. We're going to do it for the Defender and for the Challenger. So let's read through here in words these two choices that we've got. All right, the existing equipment are a Defender, has a current market value of $15,000. Okay, so that means here in the first cost for the Defender, we'd put in minus $15,000. Because if we keep our existing equipment, we're losing the opportunity to sell it. So that's a cost, which declines by 20% each year for 3 years. All right, so what that means is that the market value now is $15,000. And if it declines by 20%, that means you're losing $3,000 from the present to year one. So for the market value, it would be 80% of the previous. And then the year after that, it would be 80% of the year one. And so basically what you're going to be doing is each successive year for the market value will just be 80% of the previous year's market value, because it's declining by 20% each year. The operating cost for the existing equipment is $20,000 for year one, $8,000 for year two, $12,000 for year three. So here we put in these operating costs, and you remember how we first take those to the present in column D, and then we annualize them in column E. Finally, capital recovery, of course, is where you're going to be using the payment function and putting in both a present value and something in the future value field. So the present value will be your first cost. The future value will be whatever market value remains for the row that you're on. And then column G, the total, is operating costs and capital recovery. All right, so that is our Defender, and we're going to do the similar thing, a separate economic service life analysis for the Challenger. So you'll use the same template just below it on the same page. It has a first cost of $50,000, lasts for 6 years, and then it has the same thing of the market value declining, and then the operating costs are defined. All right, so I'm going to pause for a moment. If you want to use that same template file for in-class exercise 27, then that's a fine place to start. It's just we're going to adapt it for these new described conditions. So let me pull up that template just to remind you where that is. It's here in the Student Start Files folder, ICE 27. So it's downloaded. So we're going to do the Challenger for 3 years and the Defender for 6.
Last it for 6 years?
Because it's new equipment, it lasts longer.
What do you think about first cost? First cost on the first one, that's a 50,000. Or no, that's the second one, it is. Oh, it says it will last 6 years. I think that's the second one, though.
The first cost for
Two different ones.
Defender is
So the first one's
15,000.
3 years.
Is that right?
I don't know, I guess it's 15,000, we're gonna buy it. Right. Yeah, sure. Going like this for number periods. I got another glass for it. Cumulative, does that mean like you gotta add these two together first? Cumulative, like it's rolling, yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Like, each period is. Plus 1 year. Or is this the one, I think in this, isn't it, it's like, that thing you did last time where it's like, you have this one, and just this first one, and then this one, and these two, and then, I don't know, those three. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about? Oh, you already got that? Yeah. Okay. I think this one's where I went wrong last time. Oh, it's payment. Yeah, it's just easier. I think this one was the one that was goofy. It's like a different formula.
Okay, so let me take a moment to explain where things are at so far, and then I'll illustrate the process by going through it for the challenger. So you can see that so far I've analyzed the defender, and what I found is that it looks like among the defender choices, I can either keep the defender 1, 2, or 3 years. Of those 3 choices, the best is to keep the defender for 3 years. And so now let me analyze the challenger. And if you're still feeling a little uncertain about what's supposed to go into which fields, maybe watching this illustration will help to clarify it. Okay, so the interest rate is still 10%. The first cost for the challenger, I have to spend $50,000 to buy that. And what the problem statement said was the market value declines by 20% each year. So that means at time 0, the equipment's worth $50,000, and then 1 year later, it's worth 20% less. In other words, it's worth 80% of the year before it. So I'm going to say equals 0.8 times this amount, but the one other adjustment I need to make is the first cost is an outflow, market value is an inflow. So it should be a positive 40,000. If I sell the equipment after 1 year, I get 40,000. So again, the year after that, it's 80% of the previous value. So let me continue this trend down and fill out all of the salvage values, and it can be up through 6 years that we're considering with this challenger. Okay, operating costs are defined as $5,000 in the first year, and then it increases by $2,000 a year. So it means the previous years and then another $2,000 in cost. And then that trend just continues. All right. Present worth of the cumulative operating cost to date. So I'm doing the NPV function. What goes in is the interest rate. And then if I own it for 1 year, I only had 1 year of operating costs. If I own it for 2 years, though, then I've got 2 years of operating costs. So you can see here I've defined a range. The first input of the range is year 1, and the second input of the range is whatever row that I'm on. And so if I anchor this reference up to year 1 by pressing the F4 button, then what this will do as I drag it down, it's always going to continue to look in this cell for the first component of the range, but then whatever row I'm in for the rest of it will expand to include the entirety of the operating cost sequence. So now this 41,145 is the present value of all of these different operating costs in their respective years taken back to time 0. Now I'm going to use the payment function to annualize those present values. NPER is whatever row I'm on, and the present value is the opposite of whatever's at time 0. So I'm annualizing it. Of course, if there was just 1 year, there was that single 5,000, so that'll still again be 5,000. But the rest of these, what I'm doing is I'm finding out, for instance, rather than having a variable operating cost every year, what would I have to pay as a constant amount each year for 6 years in order to cover the operating costs? And so I could either have 5, 7, 9, this variable sequence of operating costs, or for each of the 6 years, if I'm going to own it for 6 years, then the operating cost would be 9,447. So here we've annualized the operating costs to a constant amount, which is what I'd illustrated on the whiteboard earlier. Any questions so far? Any step that I went through too quickly or that I need to explain a little bit better? All right, capital recovery. Don't just think about what needs to go into the equation. Think about what is the definition of capital recovery. Like the definition of capital recovery is the cost of ownership taking into account 2 components, the purchase price and the sales price at the end of the item's life. And so we're going to put those two things into this capital recovery function. We're going to do the payment, PMT, because we're annualizing a present and a future value. The rate is this 10%. The number of periods is whatever year we're on. Okay, present value. It's the first cost, and it's always going to be $50,000, whether we own it for 1 year or 4 years or 6 years. No matter how long we own it, that first cost was $50,000. So I ought to anchor the reference up to this initial first cost. And of course, we always get in the habit of putting in the minus sign because these built-in functions typically flip. And then the future value is this salvage. So this market value is how much we would get in revenue if we sold it in a given year. Oh, but I need to put the minus sign in there. So what it means is if we only own it for a single year, our capital recovery cost is $15,000. And we drag it down. And then total costs are operating plus capital recovery. All right. So now let's take a look at what our two options are. Our two options are to keep the equipment we already own. Should we keep the Defender or should we buy the Challenger? Our overall decision criteria is we want to choose the option that gives us the lowest total annual worth of costs. So we look at all of these and we find out which one is the lowest. Here it is, lowest. So the best choice, if we want to minimize our costs, is to continue owning the Defender and to keep it for 3 years after now. That's cheaper than buying the Challenger. So if no study period is specified, then our overall conclusion is that we keep the Defender for 3 years, and our decision criteria is that we've identified the lowest total annual worth of costs. All right, is there a certain thing that anybody'd like to see the formula for? All right, now what about if a study period is specified? We've just got 5 minutes remaining, so rather than having you calculate the second part of the in-class exercise, I'd just like to explain an overview of what the process is. If you know that you have to cover some certain number of years with whatever equipment you own, let's say that you know you have to at least have 6 years of coverage, then this option, the Defender, doesn't work across a 6-year horizon. So what you'd have to do is, if you know there's a fixed study period, is you'd have to find a substitute for what to do in year 4, 5, and 6. So it may be that you're renting some equipment, or maybe the option you're considering is, let's keep the Defender for 3 years and then buy the Challenger. So maybe the comparison is, should we buy the Challenger now, or should we buy the Challenger a couple of years in the future? So in a comparison like that, you're trying to find out which is cheaper. Is it cheaper to buy the Challenger now or to put that purchase off some years in the future? And so that's kind of the crux behind this second part of the in-class exercise for today, is we've got a Challenger and a Defender where the matchup is that the Challenger, the new equipment, lasts for 10 years, but our Defender is only good for 3. So in a situation like that, what you do is you would purchase the Challenger at the end of the useful life for the Defender. So you'd buy it here at time 4. And so what's showing here is the capital recovery for that newer equipment. You have a certain operating costs. You've got the operating costs associated with the Challenger. You've got the capital recovery associated with the Challenger. And so you'd find out overall what's cheaper, the Challenger option or the Defender option. The only kind of tricky thing is that the Challenger lasts for 10 years. And so you'd take these remaining years of operation and assign it to another project. So you just assume that the equipment is being used in some other capacity, or maybe it can be sold It's just you're early terminating the Challenger option so that it's not included in the 10-year study period. So, all right, so that's all the time we've got for today. Let's just revisit what we'd started at the beginning of class, that my office hours are adjusted because of another appointment I have. So if you need to get a hold of me, I'd be glad to help you out. We've got our exam and homework 2 on Friday, and you're welcome to prepare 1 page of notes, front side only, for the exam. See you then.